Hello and good afternoon to everyone in the United Kingdom. Good morning to all of you in the Americas. Good night in Australia, especially Paul House, who got up at the midnight to have this webinar with us. And hello from all of us in Cambridge and our global network. My name is Lawrence Sherman.
My name is Peter Nehru.
My name is Renee Mitchell.
My name is Maj-Britt Rinaldo Ronnebro.
My name is Paul House.
My name is Natalie Helps.
My name is Eleanor Nehru.
My name is Matthew Bland.
My name is Lou Bland.
I led the development of the first crime harm index here in Cambridge in 2007.
And I helped to develop the Crime Harm Index in England and Wales, Sweden, Western Australia and Japan.
I developed the California Crime Harm Index while doing my PhD at the University of Cambridge.
I developed the first Swedish Crime Harm Index for my master thesis degree in Applied Criminology and Police Management at Cambridge.
And I developed the Western Australian Crime Harm Index.
I showed how the Canadian police can use the Canadian Crime Severity Index to target people suffering and causing the most harm from crime.
I did the first analysis comparing crime counts with crime harm index scores.
I developed the first application of a crime harm index for policing domestic abuse.
I'm a professor at Cambridge University and director of the Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing.
I teach evidence-based policing at Cambridge, where I earned my doctorate after leading 2 English police agencies.
I am the president of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. I am a current senior police researcher at RTI International, and I was a police sergeant for the Sacramento Police Department, now retired.
Well, my goal is to roll out a new Swedish Crime Harm Index for use by the police in Sweden.
I'm a statistical analyst at the WA Office of Crime and Research and formerly of the Western Australia Police.
I'm a detective.
I'm a tutor for the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing and a data analyst for the Metropolitan Police Service.
I teach evidence-based policing at Cambridge and just published a book showing how to combat domestic abuse with better analysis.
Well, thanks everybody. I'm going to just briefly introduce the format for the participants out there. By the hundreds, we won't be able to answer questions from everybody, but we do have the chat feature for you to use throughout. If you want to ask a question that we can answer at the end, don't use the chat, please. Use the Q&A feature at any time in this hour. And at the end, we'll select key questions and read aloud the text and your name and affiliation to give our best answer to it. So I'm going to go first in giving an overview on the Crime Harm Index and be followed by my colleagues the further speakers for this webinar. In my presentation, I'm going to address the core ideas about why we need a crime harm index, how it works, and what difference it can make. I want to feature the 2 key publications that we hope you'll have a chance to read coming out of this webinar, if not before, and address 2 fairly controversial dimensions of the crime harm index, which is about what should be included in it. And we've argued that they should not include proactive police detections like drug arrests, because that's fundamentally different in measuring victim and witness reported harm from things like violence. And the same logic says that we don't want historic crimes because it counts things that happened years ago and it doesn't measure the current safety or harm level of a community. All of this brings us to how the Crime Harm Index can be used in policing, which is our big backdrop here at the Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing. So the core ideas, again, are why we need a Crime Harm Index, how a Crime Harm Index works, and what difference it makes. I think the main reason we need this index is because counting all crimes as if they were created equal is misleading. It creates a bias against police being able to set priorities and to invest more in some kinds of crimes than others. because the expectation is that one size fits all. Every crime should be investigated. Every crime should get lots of attention. And the resources just don't allow that, especially in the era of COVID. It also creates, in the absence of a crime harm index, counting crimes equally, creates a bias in favor of recent reports, not of the current risk of crime. And it also fails to provide evidence for setting daily priorities. So for all of these reasons, I would like to suggest that when people say that crime is up or down, they mean that they're less safe because there is more risk of serious harm, which depends not on the volume of low harm crime, which could go down, but on the volume of a small number of high harm crimes, which could go up even while the volume of low harm crime goes down. And the count would be emphasizing the low harm crime, even though total harm could be rising. So if we look at England and Wales, the differential seriousness of crime types, in a recent year, there are over 300,000 shoplifting crimes compared to 551 murders. If all crimes are given equal weight, then the shoplifting gets 560 times more weight in the total crime than murder. And if you look at Eleanor Nehru's chart on the distribution of all of the crimes, each crime being created equal, you see that homicide disappears, rape disappears, sexual assaults down at 1%, robberies at 2%. Criminal damage and thefts are by far the majority of these crimes that are reported, but if you switch to a crime harm index approach, you see that robbery all of a sudden accounts for 25% of all of the harm in the police inbox. Grievous bodily harm with intent accounts for 19% of the harm in the police inbox. The homicide at 3%. Sexual assault, rape. These are the kinds of crimes that, of course, attract headlines, that make people feel worried about victimization when they read about it. And this, I think, reflects a more realistic sense of the public's perception of safety, although that's not a hypothesis we've directly tested. But what we can clearly look at is the extent to which only 11% of the recorded crime in England and Wales is in this most serious category, and the remainder is in the less serious category. That means that overall counts can go down, even while a small percentage of crimes is going up. And the type of crimes going up, if they are high harm, will be hidden, and the public would be misled. You could say that something's rotten, even in Denmark, where we have a classic example of crime count going down in the first 5 years of the last decade. But the crime harm index, once they developed one in Denmark, turned out to have flipped around 2014 and to have soared even while the crime count continued to drop. So this raises the question, how does this kind of tool for measuring crime work? And the basic principle is this. For each category of crime, you give it a different weight, but that weight is in a common currency, like pounds would be if you were weighing your body, or kilograms for a measure of weight. But the common currency for punishment is days imprisonment. And there is a variety of ways in which you could get the metric of how much each category of crime would deserve in days imprisonment as a metric of punishment. So once you get that metric, whether it's from sentencing guidelines or average sentence, you multiply the number of crimes in that category by that currency, by the number of days in prison. And the product of that multiplication, the number of crimes by the number of days in prison that would have been imposed had somebody been convicted for them. You multiply days in prison times the number of crimes, each of which gets that many days in prison. You add that, you get that multiplication, and it becomes the weight for that category. And then if you take all categories of crimes, you can add up all of the weights from each category, and that gives you your total crime harm index value for all crimes, whether it's a community, a nation, an offender, or a victim. Now, that means we get a bottom line for crime. And in business, we ask, are sales up or down? What do we mean by sales? Do we mean the number of items sold? Usually what we mean is the number of pounds or dollars paid for all items. So if fewer items are sold, but more cost or more revenue per item is gained by the company, what do you get? You get the conclusion that it's all about the amount of money and not the amount of sales. And that's the analog here between the idea of the number of crimes and the amount of harm for crime, as expressed not in money terms, but in terms of the number of days in prison associated with those crimes. So the currency can come from moral philosophy, from court sentences, from data on cost of crime, or even public opinion surveys. Fortunately, in England and Wales, the Sentencing Council looks at all those things and makes up its mind about something Peter Nehru will tell you about, its sentencing guidelines. And it has a feature called the starting point for the sentencing range that takes out aggravating or mitigating factors, such as the prior record of the offender. And so with the robbery guidelines in England and Wales, with a maximum penalty of life, the starting point is 12 months custody. And that is the value we argue is closest to the intrinsic harm of the robbery itself, because it doesn't take the moral outrage at the offender as part of the equation here, on the theory that if your murderer is a repeat offender, it doesn't matter. You're just as dead as if it was a first offender. So these days in prison can be illustrated if you take, for example, the days imprisonment associated with 100 crimes. Suppose they were all shop thefts and you had 1 day in prison, so it would be 100 days in prison. Now, if just 3 of those crimes were changed to murder, robbery, all of a sudden you're up to 5,347 rather than 100. And potentially this shows how the CHI could lead to something that's 53 times higher than just the count of crimes. So to compute the CHI, you give the crime type a harm level, the number of days in prison, you multiply it in each crime type by the number of those crimes, and you add it all up. That's the index. That's the sum of all of those weights. And you can compute that for each offender, for each victim, in each area, at each address, indoors or outdoors, each year by time of day. And what makes this better than a feature that the Office of National Statistics actually publishes now, called the crime severity score, is that that's based on average sentences. And in actual sentences, the prior record is very heavily weighted. Whereas in the sentencing guidelines with the starting point, you can get a kind of pure measure of harm to the victim rather than the moral outrage of the offender's persistent behavior. The fact that 75% of all actual sentences are repeat offenders is clearly relevant to this. And we're very pleased that the Office of National Statistics is looking into this so deeply and having lots of good discussions about it. And we think that this may be a changing landscape in the coming years. But just to get you clear about what it does make a difference in terms of how we count. We don't have direct comparisons between the crime severity scores and the crime harm index values, although you're free to do that by taking the Office of National Statistics data as well as the data from our website at the Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing. What we would say to you is the big question is having the count of crime rather than having the weight of crime. And one thing we suggest is you not only get different trends, but you can also see the trends earlier. If we look at the crime harm index for England and Wales through 2015, as Eleanor Nehru did, we see that with some divergence happening even before the 2013 watermark, where crime stops dropping as a total count, but the harm starts going up substantially. And with the England and Wales count overall, with the crime severity score to compare to the count of crime, you see that the count of crime started going up after March 14, but the ONS crime severity index, whatever its limitations, it's certainly a weighted index, and it showed the crime severity rising 2 years ahead of the crime count. If we look at the data for those years, 2002 to 2017, for Devon and Cornwall, what we see is even as early as 2010, Devon and Cornwall had its harm levels going up much faster than the crime count level and far ahead of any increase in the crime count level. We've seen the Danish figures and the difference there. All of this is informed by two key publications on the crime harm index. One is the 2016 article that's now been read by 80,000 different computers, according to the computerized count, and a more recent statement of consensus of principles that was published in 2020. If you get the slides from us, you can download them from our website. You can read these articles for free at their journals. So the Cambridge Crime Harm Index presentation in 2016 with Peter and Eleanor Nehru is the good place to start. And then the consensus statement, which has been endorsed by former Metropolitan Police Commissioners Ian Blair and Bernard Hogan Howe, as well as Chief Constables, including Peter Nehru, Sir Dennis O'Connor, Sir Mark Rowley, and others, as well as the statistician, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. So we've got a lot of people who think this is a much more sensible way to be looking at crime rather than counting them all as if they were created equal. They also agree that we need not only a crime harm index focusing on crimes against victims, but also a removal of the historic offenses from the year in which they're reported and putting them back into the year when they occurred, a removal of proactive policing from the count of crime or the sentencing weights, because it's actually a reflection of punishment rather than of crime itself. You can generate as many drug offenses as you want to invest police resources in finding drug offenses. So it's not something like a thermometer that actually measures a change in the environment. So we also argue about detection rates being computed based on harm rather than the counts of crime, and a low detection rate being driven by a high number of low harm crimes, again, misleading the public as to what's really important. We don't want to confuse crime and punishment, and we don't want to confuse counting all crimes as equal when they're not. And we want police to put more efforts into investigating murders that have just occurred, arguably, and that could prevent further murders, as opposed to something that happened 10 years ago, even though they deserve to have careful consideration and could get ultimately more investment, but they shouldn't be counted as reflecting the safety in 2020 if they happened in 2005. So let me just skip into saying there's lots of uses in policing, but I think one of the most interesting ones is looking at places, and you'll hear more about this later on, but just to see the building height in Birmingham being illustrated with the number of crimes versus the amount of harm measured in prison days, and it produces, again, different results. But let me hand off to Dr. Peter Nehru now, who is able to speak not only as a member of the Cambridge faculty, but also as a former chief constable in two agencies and a member of the Sentencing Guidelines Council. Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Larry. So building the Cambridge Crime Harm Index, literally our starting point was the sentencing guidelines, and we went there after having looked at a whole series of attempts to construct indices. This is not a new idea. The idea goes back into the 60s when there was an earlier search to try and mark severity in crime and try and attach a score to it. Just go back one, Larry. So Larry's already shown you the grid for robbery, but again, why use sentencing guidelines? If you read the article that the three of us wrote, you'll see there was a set of principles which go to the heart of how this particular grid is created. Firstly, democratic. The guidelines reflect the fact that Parliament passed a law, but then the Sentencing Guidelines Council and its successor went through a careful process of consultation with, for example, victims groups, with sentencers, with those involved in investigating crimes, in order to arrive at a harm that was then shared by consultation across a wide range of people. Secondly, it's reliable. Those guidelines, they change as offence types change, but they don't change rapidly. They're stable. And it's very easy, once you've done the little conversion I'm about to show you, to use it. Anyone with a mobile phone can make the calculation. So if we look at the theft in a dwelling, you've got a community order at the bottom there as the starting point, and a community order is awarded with a number of hours in England and Wales. So, and I'll just come on to the process in a couple of slides about how we'd convert the hours, but you can convert community orders, you can convert fines, and you can. We're doing, next slide please, Larry. The critical thing that you're doing here is you're getting a starting point where an offender with no prior convictions is appearing for the first time. So there's no, you're not drawing on any previous convictions that will be an aggravating factor of the offender. You're not going to be listening to the mitigation of that offender from his or her barrister. You're simply getting the starting point that says that's the number of days in prison you should get as your first offence. Next slide. So if that sentence on a first offence was imprisonment, it's a simple matter of converting into days. We've gone on a slide again. It's a simple matter of converting into days that sentence into days of sentenced imprisonment. If it's a community sentence, we take the hours of the community sentence and convert that into days of imprisonment. And if it's a fine, we convert that into days by calculating the number of hours or days you need to work at the minimum wage in order to repay it. So either way, you end up with a unit of harm, which is a day or however many days of imprisonment. Final slide of my session. Now, not every country in the world, as we started to roll this out beyond England and Wales, has a sentencing guidelines framework. A fair number do, but for example, Western Australia doesn't, Sweden doesn't, and Canada doesn't, not in the same way. So how do you arrive at a similar system? Well, the short answer is you use sentencing data. In Western Australia, as you'll hear later, Paul House calculated the process using only first offenders. So again, trying to remove the aggravating factor of somebody with a long prison record. And then in Sweden, we weighed up a whole range of different approaches and arrived at an approach based on a particular facet of the sentencing process that gave the best balance between high sentences and low sentences and the best reliable approach. And one thing we've done as we've gone across all of these is we've looked at the comparison between sentencing across all the different indices that we've developed, and they are remarkably similar from culture to culture. There are minor differences on some offences, but on the whole, they're remarkably similar and remarkably robust. And I'm going to hand over back to Larry at that point.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I'm going to call now on Dr. Renee Mitchell of the Sacramento Police Department and now the Research Triangle Institute, who is the president of the American Society for Evidence-Based Policing and who developed the California Crime Harm Index. Renee, take it away.
Hi. So part of my the California Crime Harm Index was based on my dissertation, which was a hotspot study. So in the Sacramento Police Department, we looked at where high crime, high calls for service, and you could go ahead and show the map. We just did 2 districts in our downtown area to run the study. The red areas were our treatment areas, the blue areas were our control areas, and we just did high visibility 15-minute increments of high visibility policing. So we didn't give them direction about what type of proactivity to use or what kind of engagement to do while they're in the hotspots. But with the engagement in the hotspots compared to the control, we did see a reduction in Part 1 crimes and calls for service, and not so much with soft crimes. But with my dissertation, what I did is built a California Crime Harm Index based on the same idea as the Cambridge Crime Harm Index. So in California, we didn't have, with our sentencing guidelines, they really come out of the penal code. So I had to go through the California Penal Code. And in the United States, we would have to do this across all 50 states. It's not like other countries where, you know, the country has a penal code for the entire country. Our states have different guidelines for each state. So in California, we didn't really have a minimum for certain crimes that were that I saw in the hotspots. So I used the maximum to determine the amount of harm for each crime that I saw in the hotspots. And then I evaluated both, like using the difference in difference testing with the crime counts, and then I looked at it with crime harm to see if, like in this instance, you saw more of a sensitivity of the analysis with the crime harm versus crime counts. And in this case, I didn't see it in the hotspots, but that's because, you know, I had this small amount of crime. But what I did see is when I disaggregated the violent crime, and this was after the dissertation and an article I wrote, when you disaggregate like the violent crime from the property crime, what I saw was you actually got more sensitivity across like the property crimes, because the effect size went up. There was like a stronger difference between the two of them. And what the overall outcome really showed is that, just like Larry was talking about and Peter was talking about, the index gives you an understanding of these high harm, low volume crimes that are incorporated with these high volume, low harm crimes. So what the harm index is really giving you is an understanding of all these nuances across the city. So like in my hotspots, because they were so small and we didn't have these nuances, you didn't see it there. But when you start disaggregating it and looking at the harm, you see it a lot more. So that was in the paper that I wrote afterwards, is looking at the harm index is really useful when you're looking at understanding the nuances in your city or your county, more so than just crime counts.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Renee. It's really useful to see how many different ways there can be to create a crime harm index. And certainly no one worked harder at it, although many of you worked very hard. But Maybrit Ronaldo faced a little option at her first effort to do this than to talk to judges. So Maybrit, tell us about what you were doing in interviewing the judges.
Thank you, Larry. Well, I heard about the Cambridge Crime Harm Index the first time in 2012 at a lecture by Professor Sherman at the Stockholm Criminology Symposium. I was directly attracted to the idea of counting crime based on harm instead of number of crimes. Prison days was for me easier to adapt to, as this was the measurement we referred to within the police when we had a serious case that went to the final judgment, as the prison time was the final weight of success. I developed the Swedish Crime Harm Index in 2015 by asking 5 judges from the district court and appeal court to estimate the sentences for 118 crime codes for crimes against person in public area. I asked judges, as in Sweden, like in California, there is no guidelines on how to sentence an offender. We got a penal code. The judges had to ground their estimation on guiding sentences from the appeal court and precedents from the Supreme Court, similar as in a normal court case. They were asked to consider the crime code description for a crime for the first-time offender without any mitigating or aggravating factors. The final index was calculated into days spent in prison. The Pearson correlation was between 0.966 and 0.994, which made the index reliable. I had chosen the crime against person in public area, as this was where the police can prevent crime during daily policing. I tested the index by applying it on all crimes against person in public area in Gothenburg City for year 2014, a total of 2,630 crimes. I identified 56 hotspots and 60 harm spots. Interesting was that the 4 top harm spots were equally the 4 top hotspots. In the Gothenburg police, if the Gothenburg police would have a sole focus on hotspots, they would miss 50% of the harm spots. And with a sole focus on harm, they would miss 53% of the hotspots. This proved that the index in an additional tool would be an additional tool to other measurements already used by the police in identifying location for hotspot policing. The index was in 2018 applied on Malmö, a city in the south of Sweden. And the result went to be if the police had a sole focus on hotspots, they would miss 28% of the harm spots, and equally they would miss 28% of the hotspot if they only did the hotspot policing. The hotspots in Malmö were concentrated into the inner city, while crime harm spots were largely spread over the city. The crime harm can be seen as a challenge for the police of Malmö. Fredrik Kärrholm, a police colleague and master graduate at Cambridge University, developed the Swedish Crime Harm Index version number 2 in 2019, covering all crimes and crime codes. He gathered all final judgments from the district court registered by the Crime Prevention Council of Sweden. The version 2 covers all crimes of Sweden, offenders from age of 15, and includes mitigating and aggravating factors. The version 2 is calculated in months spent in prison. Version 1 and 2 are basically our first 2 steps to develop a version 3, covering all sentences gathered by the Crime Prevention Council for crimes in Sweden, for offenders of age from 21, however still including mitigating and aggravating factors. Version 3 will be democratic, reliable, economical, valid, and operational. A project is ongoing at the Crime Prevention Development Center in the south of Sweden. Expert advisors, academics, practitioners, and IT developers are now working together to develop the Swedish Crime Harm Index version number 3, and together with that, a handbook. The index will prove its use in identifying violent families, power few in domestic violence, comparing hotspots and harm spots in smaller cities, and a follow-up on the crime trends for Gothenburg city. Finally, I would like to say that when the Swedish Crime Harm Index version number 3 is implemented in 2021, it will have a financial impact on the police budget. The police will be able to show its needs of additional resources and where to locate them in the country. Basic education and further training, development of IT systems, and implementation of crime harm focused policing. This to increase crime prevention and public safety, including legitimacy of the police. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we'd like to turn to Detective Sergeant Natalie Hiltz in the Peel Regional Police in Ontario, Canada, who put the Crime Harm Index in the Canadian version to work in terms of setting priorities among victims and offenders. Natalie, take it away. Natalie, I think you better turn on your camera so that we can see you. And I'm sure Lou will help make sure that we can hear you as well. So Natalie, please join us if you would.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, and we can see you, so thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so in Canada, we calculate the amount of harm a crime causes by calculating it in terms of crime severity. So it's important to know that this weighted index is not new. It was released in 2009 by the Methods Division of Statistics Canada. So over the past 13 years or so, the notion of harm or crime severity remains to be operationalized by police here. And we continue to place emphasis on crime counts and crime reduction to govern police performance and operational decision-making, unlike many police agencies when we know it's well known to be misleading. So this is the driving force behind my current research in attempting to operationalize the Canadian Crime Severity Index through establishing the victim offender overlap here in Canada. So are victim offenders different people? No, victim offenders are not two different people. It's actually those singular individuals who enter the criminal justice system in a life course through both the suffering and infliction of harm in varying degrees of frequency and severity over time. So in other words, we're talking about criminals who are victims and victims who are also criminals. How much overlap is there? Well, to give you an example, in my 2019 study within my home police agency here in Canada, we have 27,233 individuals that were identified in 41,457 police reported violent crimes during the sample triggering intake period between 2014 and 2016. Crime counts and Canadian Crime Severity Index scores were used to prioritize and rank order individuals from highest crime severity harm score to lowest across all groups by calculating days of imprisonment based on actual sentencing. If you look at the pie chart, during the 2-year tracking and follow-up period, we were able to identify 17,138 individuals who were victims and 10,095 who were offenders. Now, what you can't see in this pie chart, but is very important here, is that a combined analysis of both victim and offender dimensions revealed that 1,665 victim offenders are present. And this happens to be 6% of this population, who are a concentrated group of high harm individuals from both victimization and offending, as established by using our weighted harm index here in Canada. So why should police be interested in the victim offender in a relationship of 6% of this population? Well, it's noteworthy to mention here that research has found the strongest association between victimization and offending exists within violent personal crimes. So think about this. This is a very wide and high level application in any police agency. This includes big issues like domestic violence, gang violence, other issues like non-fatal gun crime, with the most pronounced association within the victim offender overlap occurring in relation to homicide. So victim offenders are precisely that concentrated segment of the population who police and communities need to innovate for in preventing, disrupting, and reducing violence. So the most striking and surprising finding from the data analysis was that despite being the smallest represented group at 6%, victim offenders accounted for the highest average per person crime count and harm score against that of all other groups, meaning the small concentrated group of individuals in police data are both suffering and inflicting a significant and disproportionate amount of violent crime, making them our high harm few. So I ask you, if our highest harm individuals are found in only 6% of this population, is this group not manageable for police agencies? Does it show the most promise of impacting violent crime with the right targeted and focused police and community investments? In saying this, the study doesn't stop here. Police and community interventions are best when they're well informed. So if you look at this next chart, this is part 2 of the research methods employed in my study, and it responds to the issue of the complex interplay of variations in the victim offender in a relationship that's illustrated in this graph on your screen. Victim offenders are identified and who suffer more victimization than offending are identified as predominant victims, you see in the blue. And alternatively, those who inflict more offending than victimization are identified as predominant offenders, indicated in the red. And lying in between is the gray, which is more balanced variations of this interrelationship, as we've called the balanced victim offender subgroup. So another striking finding here from this study, from parsing the victim offender into 3 new subgroups, was this. Those victim offenders who predominantly offend were shown to have the highest mean per person harm scores over any other subgroup. This is critical information in developing well-tailored interventions to better support this group in our global violence harm reduction efforts. So embracing these advancements in place of convention can only move police agencies to a position of advantage in disrupting and reducing actual harms caused by violent crime. The successful application of the Canadian Crime Severity Index measures here in Canada are fundamental for more evidence identification in targeting the right people who are suffering and causing the most harm from crime. And being able to target our police and community resources in the places where and when we need them the most for greatest potential police and community supports.
Okay, Natalie, so let's just understand that the people who are predominantly offenders but also have been victims have a much higher level of harm in their offending than offenders who have not been victims. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And of course, that could make a huge difference when you're stretched for resources even prioritizing within organized crime or domestic abuse or other areas. So thanks so much, Natalie, for presenting that. And we're going to move now to Paul House, who has been working with a different way of developing the crime harm index for Western Australia, and also been working with the police there to assign it. So Paul, Natalie is going to be leaving, and Paul is going to click on his camera and appear as we hope he will magically, with his microphone on and his camera on, and to tell us all about the Western Australia Crime Harm Index. Paul,
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. There we are.
Thank you, Larry. Next slide. Okay, so there it is. What does a crime harm index actually look like? This is a graph of the Western Australian Crime Harm Index version 1. Across the bottom, you'll see many offence types. There are actually 88 offence types that are calculated at 4. And then on the vertical scale, you'll see the actual harm score for each of those offence types. You can see there that there are a lot of offence types that have a low level of harm. And then on the right-hand side, there are a fewer number of offence types that have a higher level of harm. So that's the way a crime harm index would look if you were to graph it. 88 offence types there. I selected a sample of 100 to choose from, and the index was built on those 100. Some of them didn't make the sample size cutoff, and I was left with 88, but that still allowed me to map the crime harm values for 95% of all the offences that occur in the Western Australian jurisdiction. So your crime harm index doesn't need to be thousands and thousands strong. You can do it with just 100. Next. Okay, so if you couldn't read the crime types at the start there, then there's a focused few that relate to domestic violence here in Western Australia. You can see the numbers down the bottom represent the days in prison, and those days in prison change according to the severity of those crime types. Next slide. Okay, so on the left there, those are the existing metrics that we had available to build a crime harm index on: costs, community survey, national offence index, but none of those were applicable in the study that I did. So we relied on court data, actual sentence data from Western Australian courts. I took the median sentence to reduce the impact of some of those more severe sentences. First-time offenders, as Peter and Larry referred to earlier on, getting that standardised baseline and avoiding the impact of the repeat offenders was done by selecting only the first-time offenders. And like I said before, I chose 100 offence types. That gave me really good coverage over the majority of offences that occurred in Western Australia. Next slide, please. This is one of the things that I built after creating the Western Australian Crime Harm Index. It's a data dashboard, or a commander's dashboard. So if you look at this dashboard, there's selections on the left for a year or a district, an area in Western Australia. There is a colour code here. The blue represents the crime count, and the green represents the crime harm. In the top middle section, you'll see there's harm score by offender age group. There's two blue columns, 18 to 29, 30 to 39. Those age groups have about the same crime count, but when you map the crime harm, the 18 to 29-year-old offenders are responsible for a higher proportion of harm. On the right at the top, the Indigenous status reflects that it's the non-Indigenous offenders that are responsible for a higher proportion of harm. And down the bottom, on the geographical map, I have there the same area that's focused on crime count in blue and crime harm in green. You can see that they look similar, but they're not exactly the same. And the tree maps on the left actually tell you what types of crimes are frequent in blue and what types of crimes are harmful in green. Next slide. Okay, so we ran a hotspot experiment similar to the one that Renee did. and it worked. It was a patrol experiment in a high crime area. We compared our treatment and control spots and the prevalence of crime in the treatment spots after 15 minutes of patrol it was a 280-day period, I think. The prevalence of crime in the treatment spots was less, so that was about 224 fewer offences per year. But when you look at that through a crime harm lens, it was a massive reduction, 62% reduction. In actual crime harm terms, 35.3 fewer years of crime harm, but the 62% reduction is a pretty significant result there. Next slide. And next. So after we mapped the crime harm index, we used it in that hotspots experiment. I then was able to, well, everyone wanted one basically within the Western Australian jurisdiction. So I mapped the crime harm values to an area in Fremantle, one of our major cities. And if you just go back one, please, Larry. That what you're seeing on the screen right now is a map of 200 by 200 metre grid squares showing the actual crime count. And if we look over on the right-hand side, down here, there's number 66 and a number 35. Those areas reflect 66 offences and 35 offences within the time period. If we then go to the next slide, you'll see those areas change when I apply a harm lens to 441 to 4,900. So there is some hidden harm that's not apparent until you actually use a crime harm index and you can see, okay, that spot there, that 200 by 200 metre grid square is where the harm has been caused in the past. Current harm, past harm doesn't predict future harm, but at least it gives us a good understanding of what the crime harm environment looks like in our area. And back to you, Larry.
Thanks so much for getting up in the middle of the night, Paul. And let's go on now to Eleanor Nehru, who works not only the University of Cambridge, but also the Metropolitan Police Service, and who with her father was instrumental in developing the Cambridge Crime Harm Index based on sentencing guidelines. So Eleanor, tell us some of the things that you learned, if only in comparing the crime harm trends to the crime count trends in England and Wales. And,
Hi, Larry. So this is a graph that Larry actually showed earlier. However, I'm going to go into it in a little bit more detail. So this is comparing the percentage change in numbers of crimes and the percentage change in CHI in England and Wales for the period from 2002 to 2014. So up to 2007, the harm and the number of crimes did track fairly closely. But then in 2007, there was a significant alteration due to the reclassification of GBH with intent. So a significantly greater number of cases ended up being classified as GBH with intent. And this caused quite a significant increase in the number of harm being recorded. And then the two tracked again fairly closely until 2012/2013, where there was a significant increase in harm. Quite a fair amount of this could be contributed to the increase in reporting of serious sexual offences such as rape. However, I think, again, referring to Professor Sherman's earlier introduction of the ideas of having separate indexes for historic versus crimes which are current for that period, I think that some of these may be due to historic crimes, and that a more nuanced index would likely separate out the historic offences from the current ones. Unfortunately, from 2015 onwards, the Office for National Statistics stopped publishing figures separating grievous bodily harm, actual bodily harm, and common assaults, and instead started publishing violence with and violence without injury. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to compare any further on in time, which would have been quite interesting to do. So we've just got the figures up to 2014. Next slide, please, Larry. So this is replicating Paul House's slide that he showed earlier, but with the Cambridge Crime Harm Index rather than his Western Australian index. So again, you can see that we start off with murder as the most harmful crime, and we go all the way down to, on the far right hand side, where it's breach of the peace, which is a sort of £30 fine scoring 0.1 CCHI points. Next slide, please. And then again, returning to the idea of how we actually create this index. So we get that graduation from murder right at the top of the range all the way down to the bottom. And obviously for the more serious offences, we can use prison sentences to create a number of days in prison. However, for offences which are less serious, the starting point is, in this country, is either a community order or potentially a Band B fine. So here we have the Sentencing Council's guideline for theft. And as you can see, when you go onto the far right-hand side of this guide, the starting point is a Band B fine. So we take that Band B fine, and next slide, please. And we can convert that using the Sentencing Council's, so they provide a sort of basic starting point for how much each fine should cost the person. So we take that Band B fine, which their minimum cost of that fine is £120. And then we look at the number of hours needed to work at the minimum wage for over 25s, which is currently £8.72. And then we round that up to the nearest whole day based on working an 8-hour day. And that gives you, for theft from person offences, a starting point of 2 CCHI points. Next slide, please. And then say if you have an offence like actual bodily harm, the starting point for that is a medium level community order. And when you look into that, it turns out to be 80 hours unpaid work. And then we take that and we look at how many hours you'd have to work to pay off the unpaid work requirement. And then we round that to the nearest whole day. So an offence of ABH would score 10 CCHI points. And next slide, please. And if anyone would like to use the Cambridge Crime Harm Index, the very latest version of it is available from the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing's website. There's a link available here. The spreadsheet looks like the example on the right-hand side and contains Athena codes, Home Office codes, criminal justice codes, and also sentence descriptors to help people match up our crime harm index scores with whatever police systems, etc., that they're using. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. And now we're going to your colleague at the Cambridge Centre, Dr. Matthew Bland, former chief analyst for Norfolk and Suffolk Police here in the UK, and somebody who has just published a book on fighting domestic violence with data. Matt, can you tell us about how you've been using the Crime Harm Index, both in teaching in our courses online at the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing, and also for our police departments that you're providing this kind of data application to show how crime harm can revolutionize the resource allocation across very high volume problems like domestic abuse that don't have a one-size-fits-all solution or indeed harm level. So Matt, can you turn on your camera and take it away?
You should be on. Can you hear me? Can you see me? You should be able to see me.
Great, there you are.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so my background is as a crime analyst working in force. So when I first came into contact with the Cambridge Crime Harm Index sort of 5 or 6 years ago, Eleanor's fantastic spreadsheet didn't exist, so I had to go and search up all those things from scratch. So it's great to see we've got to the point where actually there's a central resource that can be used by anybody who's listening and working with English and Welsh crime. And then, of course, anybody who's lucky enough to operate in one of the countries that's already developed their own crime harm index, we can hook you up with the details for those as well. Everything I'm going to sort of give you an illustration of here is based around that really simple concept of a sort of master lookup table based on offence classifications that have weightings in the way that the previous speakers have described. And all of this can be done in Excel. Professor, you've gone the wrong way in the slides there. If you could just go the other way. The thing I'm going to sort of replicate the slide that Eleanor and Paul have both shown, which I think really is worth emphasising for anybody who's thinking about using a crime harm index for analysing data, and that's that it is extremely lumpy. So obviously you've got homicide, the most serious type of crime, way up there in the thousands, sort of 2,500 times heavier than a shoplifting offence, which would be on the right hand side of this graph. And they go down in uneven breaks, so it's not an even distribution, and that does reflect when you push it through any kind of analytical framework, whether that be looking at people, victims, offenders, or places. You will naturally get some coalescence around those serious crimes. They make a really big difference to the analysis, particularly as a lot of the higher volume crimes that are reported are in those categories that are sort of below 30 days of sentence length in England and Wales. If I could go to the next slide, please. I'll talk about an example from my own work with my mentor, Barak Ariel. We wanted to have a look at how harm distributed among offenders of domestic abuse. So we used the crime harm index for this. And you can show that there is a really high concentration of severity in these offenders. So less than 3% of domestic abuse offenders typically commit about 80% of all harm. So those are the people you really want to be trying to predict before they get to that serious point. But you can also use it use the crime harm index to test hypotheses that have sort of been long-standing and may have a really big influence on common practice. So in domestic abuse circles, escalation is a really common theory that's talked about that sort of goes something like the longer cases go on, the more serious they get. We plotted police recorded crime for thousands of offenders across their first 10 crimes shown on the graph, 1 to 10 left to right, and then had a look at the average, the mean average crime harm score, and found a completely different story. Doesn't mean that escalation doesn't happen, but it does mean that we're not seeing it in police data. It's a more sensitive perspective on reoffending and potentially has a role in shaping policy at a sort of strategic level. If I go to the next slide, please. We are not the only people who've sort of dealt in this, and looking at crime harm by location is a really popular use of the tool. Sophie Curtis-Ham developed the New Zealand Crime Harm Index and has put that to use in a couple of published articles with Darren Walton. This is, I use this example, this is New Zealand for anybody who not familiar with the shape of the North and South Island. These two maps put together the Crime Harm Index, the New Zealand Crime Harm Index on the left, and something they call the Priority Locations Index on the right, which is a forerunner index, not necessarily to do with crimes, but used at a strategic level to inform the allocation of resources in New Zealand. I use this to illustrate perfectly, really, the fact that the Crime Harm Index can give you a completely different perspective on where resource is meant to be allocated. And that doesn't not to say that one is right or one is wrong, but it can lead you to look under different stones that would otherwise be unturned. And you'll see these other types of indexes, or indices, which have cropped up all over the place. For example, in the UK, we've had the Vulnerable Localities Index for a number of years. The Crime Harm Index gives you another option for analysing at a strategic level where your resources might be best invested. At the other end of the scale, if you're a tactical analyst, next slide, please, you might want to plot crime harm indices scores against micro hotspots. So this is Christobel Weinborn, who I think is online. Hello, Christobel. Cristobal's work on mapping crime harm against crime count in Birmingham. So on the left, you've got crime count, and on the right, you've got crime harm. What it really shows is that it can be easily applied to these very small units, sort of almost street corner, block, down to address level almost, levels of analysis, which can actually show up areas which don't necessarily separate out from the crowd when you just look at the frequency of crime. It also gives you a real perspective on that level of severity. So if you take on the left-hand side here, that little cluster in the middle of mini skyscrapers, when you look at that in terms of harm, you see you've got one superstructure that would attract or merit more attention than otherwise.
Well, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks to all the participants. I'm going to ask if Louise Bland, our Chief Administrator, can put everybody's camera back on while I say to all of my colleagues and to all of you who have stayed here now for more than an hour that you should be giving me poor marks as a timekeeper, because I didn't manage to leave enough time for the many questions that have been generated. So if we find out that we don't have enough resources, there's something we can do, which is to add more resources. And I think the best way for us to do that, if we can get everybody to turn their cameras back on, team, all of you who are still with us, we'd love to see you, while I spread the good news that this is part one of a discussion that's going to be continued at a date probably in early December that we'll give you plenty of notice on, but it will be an hour devoted entirely to questions and answers, which is actually a new way that a lot of universities, including Cambridge, are teaching at the graduate level. So what we're going to do is to assure you that if you've written your questions in the Q&A, that we're going to take them on board. We will start with the questions that have come up in this seminar, and we will also invite you to encourage others who weren't with us in this live showing to watch it on the recorded version at our website at just Google Cambridge EBP. You'll find this posted within a day or so. And so your colleagues can watch this hour and can join us live for the next hour in early December, where what we'll do is take your questions and try to clarify a number of points, as well as our own sense of the limitations of the crime harm index, because it's certainly not perfect. Our argument is simply that it's better than what we have right now, and I therefore would encourage you all to stay tuned for further discussions of the crime harm index, as well as look at our course offerings for online training in the use of the crime harm index in relation to overall crime analysis in fighting violent crime. So thank you very much, and let me just bring us to a close.